Of August, each week, all 5 weeks, we'll be talking about stories of Jesus. Tell me the stories of Jesus, as presented by the book of Mark, or by the Gospel of Matthew. I'm sorry. Matthew is writing specific stories to a specific group of people, largely those Jewish brothers and sisters of his that he desperately wanted to understand that Jesus, the Messiah, had come and lived among them and was present and had affected people. And this little bitty church, which had begun to grow, would soon be running out of persons who had known Jesus, persons who had seen Jesus. And so these things needed to be written down. And so they picked and they chose particular stories of Jesus that would encapsulate, represent who Jesus was, had been, and is to the people of Israel. So our first story is a familiar one, and they're all familiar ones, but we're going to be looking at them again with new eyes. Matthew 14, verse 13. Now when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them and cured their sick. When it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now late. Send the crowds away so that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves." Jesus said to them, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." They replied, "We have nothing here but 5 loaves and 2 fish." And he said, "Bring them here to me." Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to the heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. And all ate and were filled, and they took up what was left over of the broken pieces, 12 baskets full. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. This is a story which appears in all 4 of the Gospels. In Luke, it appears twice. All of the Gospel writers picked and chose stories which would best tell the story they wanted generations to come to know. But this is one which all the Gospel writers chose. There's something vital about this story to attract the attention and the memory and the writing down of it by all of them. It tells of how Jesus will provide for the needs of people, not only their spiritual needs, but their human needs as well, as in, give us this day our daily bread. And this is one of the miracle stories. He's asked to feed what amounts to an entire town. How did he do it? Did the loaves suddenly get bigger? Did they multiply in the baskets as miraculously as something from nothing? How did it happen? Matthew doesn't tell us specifically either. Jesus had come to this place because he wanted to be alone. He had just gotten the news about John the Baptist's death, which was not only a death, but it was an awful death. It was murder caused by the whims of a little dancing girl. He wanted to be alone. But as it says there in the Scripture, there were crowds who had heard that same thing too. And so they wanted answers. They were hurting as well. John the Baptist had been a very, very popular figure with a following of his own. The personal depths of grief which Jesus would have felt at this time are hard probably for us to understand in one case, but easy for us all to understand in another. John was his cousin. They'd grown up. They're 6 months apart in age. They almost certainly had grown up together. John then had devoted his life, maybe even preceding Jesus' acceptance of his life, to preparing the way of the Lord. He was a prophet. Jesus called him his prophet. A powerful figure who had been murdered on a whim. So Jesus spent the afternoon among this crowd. He had needs, but they had needs too. And Jesus saw that. In his compassion, he made his needs secondary to healing, talking to, being with those in the crowd who had come to grieve as well. Spent the afternoon among them, it says. And then the evening comes, and the disciples begin to worry. They suggest sending everybody to nearby villages to get something to eat. They meant no harm by this. They were simply being practical. It's time to call it a day. Let's build a campfire. Let's eat what we've got ourselves. Jesus had a better idea, though. He told them they need not go away. He knew that what the crowd needed was to stay together. They needed the nourishment of each other. Bad news and sad news is always better shared with others, no matter what you're eating, no matter who you're with. Just having people around at times of grief like this is important. He said they need not go away. You give them something to eat. And here's the disciples with these 5 loaves and 2 dried fishes. It doesn't talk about it here, but they must have looked at each other, gasping, and what is he talking about? This was beyond the disciples' common sense. I mean, they looked at the crowd and they saw no picnic baskets or backpacks full of food, so they didn't know what Jesus could possibly mean. They were operating from a sense of scarcity. I don't think Jesus knew how it was all going to work out either. This is Jesus the human. Yes, divine, but this is Jesus the human, like us, like his disciples. But he knew he was operating out of a sense of plenty. He knew that where there was plenty of God, there would be plenty of everything else. He holds the loaves and the fishes up and blesses them. Now, this is a crowd of 5,000, so probably not very many beyond the first row or 2 would have heard what he was doing, but there must have been muttering began to be muttered throughout the crowd. What is he doing? What's happening here? Are we going to be fed? How's he going to feed us with these little loaves and fishes? I would guess that some probably even laughed. Maybe this broke some of the tension of the day. Most were probably just simply mystified, just not understanding at all what is happening as these disciples then begin making their way with their paltry little baskets of food to those first people in the first rows. Many others were probably even embarrassed for Jesus. But I wonder if the paltry baskets of just a little bit of bread and a little bit of fish were passed, if some weren't also feeling those hardtack biscuits and that little crust of bread they'd brought from breakfast at home that morning. As they would have, they were taking a journey. If they began to feel that in their pockets begin to burn a hole, or to feel those raisins that they'd brought and had in their sleeve, as many carried food, begin to make them aware that maybe there was something they could do to help. One by one, wanting so much for this idea, this crazy idea of Jesus to work, they begin to pull out this handful of raisins or this chunk of lamb jerky or another fish here and another fish there and crusts from breakfast and biscuits and other things that they had brought one by one, maybe pretending to take something out of the basket, but in fact dropping stuff in. Like a wave through the crowd of sharing. So that at the end, when the disciples collect those baskets, there's all kinds of stuff. There's pita bread, there's Hawaiian bread, there's buns, there's Hamburg buns, there's fish, there's raisins galore. There's all kinds of things in these 12 baskets, which it said were left over and remaining at the end. But that's not a miracle, and many people are thinking that, I'm sure. That's just a crowd going from a sense of scarcity to a sense of plenty. Just a group of people refusing to play the game of what's mine is mine and what's yours is yours. That's not a miracle. Or is it? The problem with miracles is that we're sometimes mesmerized by them, focusing on God's responsibility and forgetting our own. Miracles get us off the hook. We're happy to let God feed the crowd. Let God save the world. What we have is too little to matter, after all. Stop waiting for food to fall from the sky. Stop waiting for a miracle. Participate in one instead. Be the first one to turn your pockets inside out. Be the first one on your block to get the ball rolling. There is no such thing as your bread or my bread. Give us this day our daily bread. How did it all happen in the end? Nobody really knows. But the words of Jesus go on. They need not go away. You give them something to eat and bring them here to me. In talking about the stories of Jesus, the stories aren't just in here. The stories go on. And throughout the month, part of each message will be hearing from others who are following Jesus in their ways about stories in their lives. So I've invited Sarah Noche this morning, grown up largely here in the church, now away at Vassar, just returned from China, and I've just got a couple questions I'm going to ask her, and I haven't heard her answers, so I don't know. I guess the first question I want to ask is, do you have an example in your life of God helping you, your faith, allowing you to get through a situation that you might not otherwise have been able to get through?
Definitely. As you said, I spent most of my life in this church and all of my life in Mesquite. But in this past year, I've spent most of my time either in New York or in China. So it was the first time that I ever had to leave a place. It's the first time I ever had to leave my home and to leave my place of comfort, not only emotionally, but physically as well. And going to Vassar and going to China were very similar in a way. Although they're two very different situations, the ways that God helped me were almost identical. When I went to Vassar. I've always been very shy, so I'm always worried about when I go to a new place if I'll be able to find friends or fit in or be happy there. And before I'd only been for like a week at church camp or 2 weeks at a theater camp or something, and then I'm going with people who have so much in common with me. If I'm going to church camp, we have our faith to fall back on, or if I'm going to theater camp, we're all crazy about theater and crazy about everything else. And so going to college and going to China, I was for the first time going to a place where there would be so many different people who liked so many different things and whom I had nothing in common with that I knew of. So I felt very lost and very upset when I first went to those places. I felt alone and isolated, and although I found things to do and I was going through the motions, I wasn't quite into it or happy. But in his way, God helped me find a home and helped me find him through great friends that I've made and through wonderful experiences and through old hobbies. When I went to Vassar, I was able to get involved in theater, and I was able to meet these amazing people that lived on my hall that I can't wait to get back to at the end of this month. And in China, I met girls from all over the world, and we would just go around to tourist little places and tour China. So it's not that while it was happening, I was ever thinking, wow, this is what, wow, God is doing this. But now that I look back on it, I see that God sent me a home, and he sent me that place of comfort through those people and through those hobbies and through those experiences, so that although I wasn't physically home or with my family, I was able to find a home through God and find a place of comfort. So that way I'm always home, no matter where I am, because he's there.
God is with us. We are never alone. Thanks be to God. Is there a time, an experience maybe long ago or last week when you had one of those be still and know that I am God experiences where there were no words, there were no phrases, there was just the soaking in of God's presence around you? You ever had one of those kind of?
Yes, I have. When I was in China, a lot of the girls left because I was there for 2 months, and so a lot of girls left the day before I did, so I had a whole day where I wasn't flying out, but I didn't really have anything to do. So I decided to go to the Summer Palace, which is where the imperial family, thousands of years ago, would go for the summer. It's on this huge lake and these mountains. It's beautiful. And it just kind of exemplifies everything that's really, really cool about China. Because when you go to China, I mean, this place is, Beijing itself, which is where I was, is 3,000 years old. But China is 6,000 years old. So when you walk around, you have these buildings that are 3,000 and 6,000 years old, still standing, and people still live in them and use them. It's not like they just sit there like most of our tourist places. These places are living and breathing, and things continue to happen and have been happening there for so long. And so I go up the Summer Palace, and there's tons and tons of stairs, and I'm walking up this mountain, and I get to this place where there aren't too many people, so I decide to sit and take a break. And I'm sitting underneath this beautiful ancient gazebo that was built 1,500 years ago. And I'm looking out, and from my vantage point, you could see all of Beijing, the modern city. You could see the lakes of the Forbidden City and of the Summer Palace, and all of the ancient architecture meshed and combined with the modern architecture. And then you could see the mountains, and it was raining that day, so the sky was beautiful. You could actually see the sky, which you couldn't usually. And it was just so amazing. And I got to thinking about everything that had happened at that particular spot, just thinking about how emperors had designed that spot in mind for them, and how I was sitting there, and how even before them there were people who used that spot, not even knowing its significance, and how thousands of years in the future people will sit or walk on the same spot and may not even know what it's for, or what it once was. And I just kind of got to thinking about how, I know this sounds cheesy, how infinite everything is, and how God is even bigger than that. How I can't even wrap my mind around the beginning of time, of cognizant human beings, yet he's been here from way before that and will be here way after that, but I can't even wrap my mind around that little small second of his world. So I think that I didn't really have a moment of be still and know that I am God, but a moment of be still and know that I am God. I had a breakthrough of what it meant to be God and what God was. Not that he was the only God. I've always grown up with that idea, but that he is, of the being that he is, and just more of an understanding or getting closer to what I think he is. And I thought that that was amazing in just such a little way.
It is. Those kinds of moments are very, very difficult to express and to verbalize, but thank you.
Thank you.
The stories go on, and it's those moments. Imagine that crowd having been fed by whatever means, how they would have left that place. A moment in time which affects eternity. These kinds of things, standing there, seeing everything, and just knowing how it fits together, this moment in time that represents all of eternity. So thank you. That's exactly the kind of stories about Jesus, and they are, that we all have. We see them in different ways. We speak them in different languages. But nonetheless, it is the Christ through history, the Christ in our lives, the Christ right now. Amen.